Canada's economy is falling behind other countries. As recently as 2020, business school IMD ranked Canada as having the number 8 most competitive economy in the world. In its latest rankings for 2023, Canada fell all the way to number 15. That's a 7-spot drop in 3 years. Canada's economy is in freefall. The country is falling on almost every metric covered by the IMD rankings. It's in 16th place on government efficiency, down from 10th place 3 years ago. On business efficiency, Canada has fallen from 10th place to 17th, and on infrastructure, it has fallen from 8th place to 11th. You can't blame COVID-19 for this collapse. After all, the whole world had to deal with the pandemic. So why is Canada falling behind today? In our earlier video, we discussed the role played by Canada's stagnating productivity, the country's constantly growing housing crisis, and excessively high immigration levels. But there's far more to the story than that. In this video, we're going to look at another major factor playing into Canada's economic decline, starting with Canada's soaring food prices. Like many other countries, Canada has seen a bout of high inflation over the past few years. But unlike in many other countries, that inflation hasn't gone away when it comes to food prices. For more than a decade, Canada's food prices grew slowly, averaging an increase of between 2 and 4% per year. But during the recent inflation spike, food inflation jumped above 10%. And even as inflation calmed down over the past 6 months, food prices continue growing strongly, at around 8% annually. So what's going on with food in Canada? Why are prices rising faster than for other things? The simple answer is a lack of competition. In a recent report, the Competition Bureau of Canada blamed rising food prices on the fact that there is very little competition among grocery stores. In an economy with lots of competition, companies must compete with each other to earn their consumers' business. And one of the ways they do that is by offering lower or better prices for the consumer. Without competition, grocery stores can simply charge what they want, and consumers have no alternative. At first glance, it might look like Canadians have plenty of options when it comes to where they buy their food. There's Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys. There's Safeway and IGA, Provigo and Super C, Foodland and Longo's. The list goes on. But dig into the ownership of these supermarket chains and what you find is that they're all owned by 3 companies: Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys. All those different brands are just an illusion. Over the years, these companies have bought up the dozens of grocery store chains that used to operate across Canada. These 3 companies, along with Costco and Walmart, account for 93% of Canada's grocery sales. They have created an oligopoly with enough market dominance to ensure they never have to compete on price. All 3 of these dominant supermarket chains participated in what is known today as the Great Canadian Bread Price-Fixing Scandal. In 2018, the Competition Bureau concluded that 7 Canadian bread-producing companies committed indictable offenses by fixing the price of bread between themselves. And it emerged that these bread makers did so on the demands of the major grocery chains, namely Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys. In a country that grows as much wheat as Canada, bread can be very cheap, so these retailers pushed the country's major bread makers into setting prices high above where the markets would have set them naturally. It's estimated that this price-fixing scheme ran for 14 to 16 years and added $1.50 to the price of every loaf of bread. And the reality is that this is just the one time that the retailers got caught. How many other things are they fixing prices on? We may never know. After all, it's not like Canada has effective law enforcement agencies breathing down the necks of the major supermarket chains. And when an industry is captured by an oligopoly, it often doesn't require outright collusion on prices to strip consumers of choice. They can just follow each other's pricing moves. Take a look, for example, at Canada's banking sector. Unlike the United States, where there are thousands of banks, large and small, banking in Canada is dominated by 6 large institutions: RBC, Scotiabank, National Bank, CIBC, TD, and BMO. These 6 banks control 93% of the banking assets in Canada. As a consumer, your only other option is to go to a credit union. But those credit unions have a tiny share of the market, and guess what? They keep their money in the big 6 banks. When one of the major banks raises the fees it charges to customers, the others quickly do the same, and usually by the same amount. No matter which bank you go to, you'll get the same products and services for the same price. The result is that Canadians pay among the highest banking fees in the world, on average almost $200 per year. There might as well be just one bank in Canada for all the difference it makes. Another major oligopoly is in the telecommunications sector. If you have a cell phone in Canada, it's almost inevitable you're with one of 3 companies: Bell, Rogers, or TELUS. Between them, they control almost 90% of the mobile phone market in the country. Like with supermarkets, Canadians think they have a choice because of the other brands out there, such as Fido, Koodo, or Virgin. But those are flanker brands owned by the big 3. The result is that Canadians have, if not the highest, then among the highest wireless costs in the world. And if you need proof that this oligopoly is driving up prices, just look at the costs of wireless prices in the provinces where there's a fourth carrier. In Saskatchewan, there is SaskTel, and in Quebec, there's Videotron. In both those provinces, wireless costs are lower than they are in the rest of the country. There used to be a third province in Canada that had a fourth carrier, Manitoba, where MTS used to operate. Then Bell bought MTS and prices went up almost instantly. Then there's the airline industry, perhaps the most concentrated sector in Canada's economy. Airlines in Canada are a duopoly, with Air Canada and WestJet dominating the entire sector. Between them, they control 80% of the market. The only other notable competitors are Porter and Air Transat. But Porter is a regional carrier, mostly flying between cities in central Canada and the US, and Air Transat is a charter airline. Air Canada and WestJet are basically the only game in town, and it shows. Canada is number 6 in the world for most expensive passenger flights. These companies barely care at all about customer service or sticking to their schedules. In a recent survey, Air Canada and WestJet ranked as the 2 worst airlines in North America for on-time performance, higher prices, and bad service. This is what Canadians have become used to thanks to the oligopolies that dominate almost every industry. But how did it get like this? To understand that, we have to go back in time to the early 20th century. In the years after World War I, Canadian railway companies, including the largest railway in the country, the Grand Trunk Railroad, massively overbuilt new rail tracks. They got themselves heavily into debt, and when those debts came due, they went bust, wiping out investors from Toronto to New York to London. The government responded by nationalizing the railroad companies, creating out of them the government-owned Canadian National Railway, which still operates to this day as the largest railroad in Canada. From that point on, it became normal for the government to consolidate and control industries in Canada. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, many of Canada's banks got into financial trouble. The government watched as next door in the US, some 9,000 banks failed. In order to stop the same thing from happening in Canada, the government orchestrated the consolidation of Canada's banks into the 6 big institutions that exist today. There used to be a Bank of Toronto and a Dominion Bank of Canada, and today it's the Toronto Dominion Bank, or TD. There used to be a Canadian Bank of Commerce and an Imperial Bank of Canada, and today it's the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, or CIBC, and so on. Pretty soon it was accepted as normal that in Canada, in any industry, there are either a small handful of private companies controlled by the government or a single company owned outright by the government. When the age of airlines began, it was the Canadian National Railway that set up Canada's government-owned airline. Originally called Trans-Canada Airlines, it's known today as Air Canada. By the 1960s, Canada was an economy of government-controlled monopolies and oligopolies. Bell Canada was the government-owned telephone company. Air Canada was the government-owned airline, and so on. Starting in the 1980s, the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney attempted to break up these monopolies. This worked for a while until it didn't. Canada's businesses had become too accustomed to not dealing with competition, and when competition was forced on them, they quickly consolidated back into oligopolies or monopolies. Take, for example, the airline industry. For a while, Canada had many competing airlines. There was Wardair, Nordair, Eastern Provincial, and others, but they were no match for Air Canada. Most of them quickly shut down or were swallowed up by Air Canada or its biggest competitor, Canadian Pacific Airlines. Canadian Pacific struggled for years, rebranded as Canadian Airlines, and eventually got bought out by Air Canada, leaving Canada with one major airline. Meanwhile, a small upstart called WestJet actually managed to succeed, and so today Canadians have just these 2 airlines to choose from. A similar thing happened with phone service. When Bell's monopoly over long-distance phone service was broken up, many new phone companies showed up, but they too struggled and got bought out by the larger players. The 3 companies that have control over phone services today were all companies that originally benefited from government monopolies. Bell started out as Canada's national government-owned phone company. TELUS started out with the merger of the government-controlled local phone companies in Alberta and British Columbia, and Rogers built itself into a telecom giant through government-granted monopolies over cable TV. It has been a long, long time since Canada's major industries have had to deal with real competition, and today's business leaders have no idea how it's done. Most of the innovation in Canadian businesses amounts to copying what has already been done in the United States. When a company like Rogers or Air Canada or Sobeys innovates some new product or service, they're literally just ripping off something that had already been done by American businesses. No wonder Canada can't compete on the world stage. It has nothing to offer. The IMD ranks Canada as the 5th 15th most competitive country in the world, but specifically on international trade, Canada ranks in 50th place out of 64 countries. It falls below countries like Colombia, Kazakhstan, and Romania. That's a pathetic performance for what is supposed to be one of the world's wealthiest, most dynamic countries. Why would anyone buy anything from a country that has nothing to offer? But the real tragedy of Canada's lack of competitiveness is that there is a price to be paid for it, and Canadian consumers pay that price every day. In fact, Canadians aren't paying more for just groceries and cell phone bills these days. They also need to pay much more for housing, which is leading to the imminent collapse of Canada's housing bubble. To learn more about that, check out our recent video by clicking here. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.